Really very happy that the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi accepted our invitation to give an invited talk to this community. He is difficult to define. He's an educator, he's a monk, he's a philosopher. He entered a Buddhist monastery at the age of 10. But then later on, he had graduate education at Harvard in physics, but also philosophy and international relations. He is right now at the MIT Media Lab as the director of the ethics initiative there, and also the president and CEO of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT. And today, he will talk about ethics, empathy, and extended intelligence. So, Tenzin.
I have nothing to do with those slides. I do dress up like a superhero. There are places where I do have powers, other places where I don't. Can you hear me all right? I generally tend to stay away from stages. So if you can see me, I'll just speak from here. And I'll try not to burden you with slides. I'm sure you've been seeing slides all day. Rather than sort of repeating or giving different versions of ethical dilemmas that we see in AI or machine learning related issues, I thought I'll just touch on a few things. And for me, it's perhaps more of a privilege and an opportunity to engage in a conversation along these lines. And so I would generally I tend in these kinds of gatherings to leave more time for conversations. Primarily the issue, firstly, around ethics is intent. Intent around the sense of why are we designing certain things? Why do we design certain things? And do we actually really, have we ever actually asked that question of ourselves? Some years ago, a group of my undergrad students at MIT, some of them were my students, but the team, between the age of, say, 17 to 19 and so, conducted an experiment. They did a wonderful thing by altering the genetic composition of the E. coli bacteria. Now, those of you who are familiar with E. coli, it stinks. It smells really bad. So what they did was they changed the genetic structure slightly to make E. coli smell like spearmint. And as the bacteria declined its life cycle, it would start to smell like bananas. Now, it was a major feat for this group of young scientists. And so they were getting a lot of press, and during one of their engagements, they were being interviewed by NPR. And the person asked them questions about how they conducted the experiment. And there was a lot of excitement in the team, and they were responding to all these questions wonderfully. And then the person asked, "Why did you do it?" And there was this long pause. And one of them broke the pause by saying, "Because we could." And that was a worrisome phenomenon in the sense that have people actually thought deeply about the intent of what are the things that they are designing. Meaning that our designers, and by designers here in this framework, I would put in people who are programmers, who are writing algorithms, who are creating frameworks for those algorithms as well, that do they have any sense of moral agency around the products that they design? And what I mean by moral agency again here is that do they seriously take a sense of responsibility? Now, traditionally, you see, what has happened in the world of science is that we don't want to have conversations around ethics, because ethics is often seen as a restraining feature. It has been seen as something that is sort of anti-science, anti-development of science. And so what generally happens is that we try to sort of steer away from conversations around ethics. It is going to stop development of science. But as users, when you're using any kind of aspect of those scientific inventions that get commercialized as technologies and so on, then you have to beckon this question of who is ultimately responsible for the kinds of decisions that we make and that are determined by designers or a core set of designers. Now, traditionally what has also happened is that we have failed oftentimes to make a distinction between ethics and compliance. So generally when companies want to have this discussion around ethics, they bring in a bunch of lawyers. Lawyers, for the most part, are not considered highly ethical beings. But they're very good at telling you what the law is. And then what happens is that designers talk about this, and most of it again becomes an aspect of, well, are we in compliance with a given set of laws of a given society or given government? And the second question that often gets asked is, in the worst case scenario, if something goes off, what would the cost be? What would the cost involved be? And as we have seen in most of the ethical breaches in the past 10, 15 years, that most companies can afford to pay the cost of breaching these sets of compliances. So personally, my venture around ethics has been around the optimization framework. Optimization framework in the sense that encouraging designers and companies not to think of ethics in the aftermath, not post-deployment, not when the problem arises, but actually trying to think of ethics from the design phase, from the very beginning of the design phase, and having a group of individuals who are hopefully not just engineers, to talk about what are the possible ways in which we can think about really, not only what the product would do, but what the product might end up doing. Okay? And if it might end up doing certain things, what are the pros and cons of that, and how can we sort of shift our way around it? Now, as Patrick has already suggested, the complexities around ethics. One of the challenges around ethics is that I do believe that we should be able to design an intelligent system around that. But we actually don't have very good models of how humans learn ethics. And this has been a challenge, which is that, you see, partly I think our educational institutions are at fault around this thing, because we spend a lot of time giving individuals skill sets to develop certain kinds of faculties. But when it comes to ethical decision making, it's kind of a gamble. It's like we'll either leave it at your parents, or probably your grandparents who can teach you something about ethical values, or maybe you will learn it as you go along. You see? And this thing about learning as you go along is what ends up causing financial crises and meltdowns and so on. So part of the deeper sort of issue is, how do we actually learn about ethics? When the founders of internet, when they were designing internet, they had all these ideals. They had all these ideals about, what internet would do, what internet could do. And they talked about freedom, they talked about democratization of information, and they talked about all the wonderful things that access to internet will bring to human society. Then came social media. And they gave wonderful arguments about what a social media platform could do, how it could connect people, how it could connect people from far-reaching worlds just by virtue of internet, and how it can create certain kind of interest groups and so on. And one of the things that, despite of certain social media companies they were pointed this out early on, that what they might end up doing is augment tribalism, augment this basic instinct that all of us have evolutionary in terms of the sense of tribalism, but sort of put that sense of tribalism on steroids by digitizing it. Some got a bit concerned about it. Others said, we'll deal with it when it comes. Well, it came, and you had your election, and somebody won. Part of the question becomes, it's not about the political choices that you make here, but the question becomes is that whether our infrastructure, meaning whether our systems, our social systems, political systems that have taken hundreds of years to get to a certain stage, whether it can actually survive the kinds of technology designs we are putting in marketplace. Meaning, can democracy survive internet? Can democracy survive social media? And so the issue becomes is that, are we as designers truly thinking about the interface, not just with human behavior or how humans make decisions, but also with regards to institutions that we have held sacred, that we have fought for so long, to be in place. And this is where we cannot simply say transfer of responsibility. We cannot say it's not my problem. So, before the current president came into power, there was no such thing as March for Science. Why? Because scientists wanted to keep their sanctity. They wanted to remain amoral creatures. Amoral creatures, not personally, but just in the professional sense, that my experiment should not have moral leanings towards it. We should not be taking sides. And it's understandable. I respect that. But when you have far-reaching social impacts of it, at some point, you're forced to ask yourself, can I still continue to remain amoral or not? Meaning, what is the long-term civic responsibility of an individual? And these are the kinds of questions that become of foremost importance in terms of the design virtue, in terms of the design sense of things. The other aspect of it comes is, again, in terms of intent, what is it that we are designing for? Now, much of our process around design, I see a lot of ethics and empathy-related design things that are coming out from the AI world. And honestly, as a monk, I see it as just a PR gimmick. It's a marketing campaign, you see, for whatever groups and all. So the intent becomes important. Intent becomes important in the sense that, are you simply concerned, are we as designers simply concerned about designing for efficiency or something more than that? Because if you're designing for efficiency, there are many aspects of human society that we hold dear, okay, that we would not be caring for. Meaning, even the sense of caring oftentimes is not efficient. Like, prior to what Patrick suggested, what the Germans came up with in terms of how a vehicle should cross the road if there were two human beings in front. One of the earlier proposals of that was that the algorithm should do an age demographic chart. So if it has to choose between a younger person and an older person, run over the older person. Because perhaps the younger person has more potential and so on and so forth. That was one of the propositions, believe it or not. The Germans decided, no. Let just the car go straight and then leave it up to chance who gets hit by it. Meaning it's not rooted in the sense of care. It's always designed for how fast, how big, whether it can be scaled up or not. You look at, I'm sure at some point during the day, I think there was somebody from ACLU who was talking about criminal justice system. All the algorithms that are currently in place, that are being used by judges in criminal justice system, they're all, again, designed for efficiency. And all it is doing is that it is augmenting the existing biases. You can take a side and say, the biases have always been there, it's very hard to get a clean data. But working with limited amount of efficiency with biased data is one thing, than having greater efficiency with biased data. And I wish for you that you're not sitting in front of one of those judges. Because that's where I think this issue of efficiency versus empathy becomes of crucial importance, meaning that if you're designing a system to be more of an empathetic interface, and I am not suggesting that AI systems themselves will become empathetic, but there are conditions to fulfill that sense of empathy that is important to take into account when we are designing certain kinds of systems, to say that it's not just about efficiency. One of the things that I often tell individuals, or suggest to them more likely, is that human beings are highly inefficient creatures. You see, that's built into it. And the lives that we live are also highly inefficient in that regard. I mean, if we were purely concerned about efficiency function, the best thing we can do is die. There's no other argument around it. You see, the best thing, if you're truly just concerned about efficiency system, the best thing we can do is die. But we are not. There are other factors that drive our life. There are other factors that drive our day-to-day decision makings. And part of the process in terms of designing this thing is how do we bring in those variables in the design process itself. The second part of it is that not to use AI systems just to generate empathy. Generating empathy is an easy part. You see? New Orleans was flooded, there was massive empathy. 9/11 happened, there was mass empathy. The challenge with human society is sustaining that sense of empathy. So it's not just about how do you create empathy for the short term. And that's, I think, one of the areas that would be useful if we can think of, and I can think of all the wonderful things that AI system might do in the field of medicine, education, and so on. But if we can think about AI systems acting as sort of this sense of extended models of human intelligence that allows us to sort of look back and reflect on certain kinds of decision-making abilities by giving us sort of deeper understanding around it, so that not only we become designers of the system, but that it is a constant sort of mutual growth. It's a mutual support system that we are able to create. So it's not just about using it for faster calculations, faster analysis, and so on, but also thinking of how will it actually help us modify our behavior for better. Okay. Then, of course, I'm also concerned about other issues. I'm not concerned about labor displacement and so on. That's going to happen. I'm concerned about the depression, the massive depression that might create, and whether our infrastructures, health systems, social systems are actually capable of handling that. I'm concerned about the argument that people make about free time. When was the last time human society was good at utilizing free time? We don't have a very good history with free time. So the issue then becomes is that arguments such as free time sounds very attractive, but you have to understand what is going to take place in that. Is there going to be some kind of growth, or all we will be doing is sort of sucked into certain forms of entertainment system with no growth? So part of the challenge becomes is are there systems, are there models in place of what we are going to do with this sense of free time? So not just thinking about artificial intelligence as a tool for efficiency, but thinking of it more in terms of how can we actually design things so that it can take some of the important aspects, important variables that drive human society in place. Now, you can give a very stoic argument about S functions and J functions and evolutionary models and so on, but some of these fundamental concerns still remain. And one of the things that we are trying to push for, even from Media Lab side of things, is that how the AI conversation needs to be anti-disciplinary. It cannot be simply just a bunch of engineers in a room thinking about what's going to be good for society in the long term or not. But at the same time, when we're talking about ethical frameworks, at the same time, we need to do a better job in terms of understanding how do we actually train individuals to make better ethical decision making. We don't have that in our education institutions. Ethics for us has been a gamble. We believe that somehow people will acquire this mode of thinking, of ethical decision making. Somehow they will be good, somehow they will be kind, somehow they will become a better human being. We don't actually have a system that provides those skill sets. So I'm hopeful that with at least the intervention of AI in education system, that we might be able to actually explore some of that as well. And then, just taking on that motorcycle example about helmet and without helmets, just as an anecdote, we were actually running the scenario with the Japanese automotive company. And I think 97% of the people in the room said that the car should swerve and hit the person with helmet. And the reason being that that person, that 97% of the people said the car should swerve and hit the person without helmet, because the person who was wearing the helmet was following the law. And we started having some follow-up discussions around that, and it turned out that it wasn't just about law, it was about cultural biases. It was about how a culture is inculcated in certain form of rule following than other cultures. And so then the issue becomes is that do we lose the ability to make, again, empathetic, objective decision-making processes. So there's a lot that goes into decision-making. Half the time we're not even aware of it. And part of the challenge becomes is, can we create some level of self-awareness around it. Maybe I'll take a pause there. If there are people who are working in creating introspective AI, I would be very happy to have that conversation. If looking into creating a more empathetic AI, and by that I do not mean that AI itself will become empathetic, but certain tools that we can contribute, certain values that we can allocate in that system. There is a group of students from my team that's working on lensing of sorts that just to help override some of these biases in algorithms that are used by criminal justice system. And again, perspective taking. Again, go back to the basics of how humans learn. If we are learning in an insular setting and making decisions in an insular fashion, they are very limited and they are very biased. So even as humans, when we learn, taking perspectives have been a useful thing. But when we design algorithms and we say algorithms should not take perspective because it takes too much time or there's a lot of cost involved, you see, then again we are making that argument for efficiency and we simply perpetuate the existing models of biases and we augment it, we scale it up, we congratulate ourselves, and then we say what went wrong. The less opportunity we have to ask what went wrong would be useful for us. Maybe I'll take a pause there. Thanks.
I'll try to project.
Yeah.
Thank you, that was really great. I'm a graduate student at Cornell studying computer science, and you mentioned this a little bit, but I wanted to get more of your thoughts on what training do you recommend for graduate students who are interested in artificial intelligence, and what do you think graduate programs and those who are mentoring graduate students can do to make sure that we have well-rounded young researchers who are joining the community?
That's a terrific question. I do think, despite of all the excuses that institutions make about time versus requirement for a kid to graduate, especially when it comes to training engineers with focus on machine learning or AI, there should be some requirement around taking certain courses in humanities. And more importantly, even courses around ethics that allows you to sort of think through certain kinds of scenarios is helpful. It's a different form of critical thinking. It's a different form of critical thinking that is generally required when you're taking engineering lessons. The other thing that is useful, Joe Ito, the head of Media Lab, and I, we co-teach a course called Principles of Awareness. And initially it was designed to look into simply, clarify principles around human-centered technology. Right? But it evolved in a manner where, because students started to ask certain questions of their experiments and things that they were doing, that we started looking into just how do you explore the notion of awareness itself. Okay? Not just vis-a-vis users, not just vis-a-vis who you're designing for, not just vis-a-vis the team that you're working with, but other sort of drivers of what would make a well-aware system. And I think experiments of that sort are useful.
What is your understanding of, or what type of values would be inculcated? Because I see a difference between, let's say, ethics taught here versus some course developed in ethics, let's say, in eastern part of the world.
Right.
So would your ethics course include all types of values or logical models which exist, or only a certain type of ethical, constraints? Because in that case, it will then again
perpetuate biases.
Yes.
I don't believe in a prescriptive model of teaching ethics. I think we have failed miserably in that. We have tried it in different variations, and it's not even a cultural issue. Any culture where you teach a prescriptive model of ethics, you actually you have a lot of unintended consequences around it. My sense at this stage, but the experiments that we have conducted, at least with a couple of universities, is that if you take a non-prescriptive approach, and by non-prescriptive approach I mean that it's not history of ethics, it's not sociology of ethics. It's more about understanding the correlation between how do we come to inculcate certain values, you see, and then certain critical thinking models to understand how they prime certain decision making, how do we understand trade-offs. Most of us are even ignorant about trade-offs, which we do on a daily basis, without weighing what comes when, sort of thing. So part of, I think, the process is just showing that part. And the other part is intent. Intent, I think, is very important. Why even be ethical? So again, if you're just driven by efficiency model, being a little ethical is helpful. But if you're driven by a model of care and empathy and so on, it requires a greater degree of sort of ethical imagination.
I'm sort of concerned about this dichotomy between care and empathy.
Yes, sir.
Care might be the most, care and efficiency, or empathy and efficiency, because empathy might be the most efficient way of doing things. Care might be the most efficient way of making friends or building trust.
Maybe. And again, one of the things that I'm trying to discourage people is just to have binary outcomes to things. So it might appear as a dichotomy. It's not like I'm anti-efficiency. But I do believe that if the focus is just on efficiency, the outputs are going to be radically different from if the focus was care, empathy, and so on.
For the last several years, thinking about this topic, I have been struggling with this question of why be ethical?
Yes.
What is the meaning of this thing? I'm seeing it as part of common sense knowledge, but why do individuals need to be ethical? And where I'm coming is the notion that a society proposes a set of ethical principles to the individuals within it in order to encourage them to have positive sum interactions. So if we cooperate, then we can have a positive sum interaction. If we compete or I exploit or we try to exploit each other, then we're going to have a negative sum interaction. So the prisoner's dilemma is sort of the obvious trivial example of this. But if I am optimizing my own welfare, my own utility, then an option that gives me one more unit of reward, even if it takes 3 units of reward away from you, is my choice. It should be my choice. And it is taught in AI courses as being the rational thing to do. So I would actually advocate anyone who sees the word rational,
Take it with a grain of salt.
trademark, up in the corner, take it with a major grain of salt. And so the purpose of ethics is so that we collectively increase the welfare and resources of our society. And now many people have been observing that over the years, over the centuries and millennia, there have been many, many societies, and the ethical rules have changed. And we've all observed even quite dramatic changes in recent years and decades. So the society evolves. At a given point, we want to say, here's the ethics for today that we believe does the best job of improving our collective welfare. But we're not the end point.
Right. So I agree with the observations that you have suggested. I think in the current framework, I think more than when we talk about the relevance of certain value metrics, more than thinking about things just in terms of good or bad, because that's a philosophical conversation we haven't solved for eons. I think one of the most relevant things would be well-being, to look at individual and social well-beings, and I think there's more alignment there in terms of conditions of well-being than even questions like, are we happy or not? And I think, there needs to be some more work around that area of whether you can create systems that might help us both understand what this various evaluations of well-being is, because the current metrics are either very outdated or actually a greater degree of exaggeration or approximation around it. The other part of it becomes always is that, human beings have, the more educated they are, the more educated they are, and this is just my observation, my bias, is that they have a greater degree or greater ability to rationalize things or justify things to their own benefit. Okay? And this is the argument that I often see when people say that they're designing something to make the world a better place. Okay? You see this argument a lot, that everything, even if it's a semiconductor chip, that it's going to make the world a better place. And I don't doubt their sincerity, but I do doubt their framework. I do doubt what sort of storytelling is going on. So that's my other interest these days, which is around self-deception. Self-deception in individuals and organizations, and how we actually perpetuate it. So lack of transparency is just another extension of deception. It goes back again to this issue of intent, that if we are going to design models that are primarily driven by a sense of, only with a sense of self-cherishment, our society can only hold so many narcissistic individuals at any given moment. After that, things are going to blow up. So the issue becomes, what is our longitudinal, objective on what the society should be like, and those should be the drivers for it. So, I must have said something really. Go ahead, please.
My name is Duncan. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland. So my question is on how you incorporate ethics into the design process. Because, as a technologist, as a scientist, it's impossible to predict how your development will be used in the future, 10 years, a month.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very good question. And again, the first thing is that one way to do that is to open the room, despite of all the proprietary nature of technology that you develop. Okay? We are actually doing some experiments out at Stanford with a group of core design members from major company who are actually concerned now as being agents for perpetuating something that they as designers actually don't believe in. Okay? Partly the issue becomes, let me give you an anecdote. I think I can share it. Is it getting recorded? Well, I can share it. So we had one director's fellow at Media Lab, J.J. Abrams. I think most of you probably know of him. He was visiting the lab, and he asked a simple question. He asked, sitting with a bunch of research scientists and designers, he said, so do you guys design something that could destroy the world? Or could be used like really in an ugly fashion? And everybody said, no, we don't do those kinds of work. And he took a pause, and then he said, I think he was just looking for another movie plot of some sort. So he took a pause, and then he said, well, can you imagine that you have designed something or you're working on something that could be used to destroy the world or create some certain ugly situations? And everybody goes, yes. So part of it is framing the question. How do we frame the question is of tremendous importance. And sometimes it helps to have an outside field, an outside discipline, ask those questions of us. Right? That's one thing. But we can go into more of the nitty-gritty aspect, and I think you'll hear about it in 2 or 3 months around this idea of how within this ethics as optimization framework, that how one should be using ethics from the very beginning of design process. It's a longer conversation. I'm happy to have that.
How does one deal with your ethics differs from the ethics of the society you live in. For example, I come from a society where many people value expediency over privacy.
Yes. Privacy is dead. I think it's a lost battle. I like to be a realist despite of being a monk. I have some idealism. That's what I'm aspiring for. I think So this is the issue we run into is that we can't even have values that we agree with among individuals in the same team, even in the core design team of the same company, let alone the society that you're working for. And so part of the issue becomes here a conversation around the principle of shared values in terms of what you can uphold and what is the trade-off cost of not upholding some things. And expediency is a good word, but it again becomes issue of who the demographic is, in what period of time, and what impact it is going to create. Because the worst thing that I'm finding in technology industry is the storytelling that goes on. I come from a religious world, primarily. We have had thousands of years of storytelling. So when I see something as a deceptive form of storytelling, that sort of bothers me. My radar goes off in that way. So, if you're going to truly design something to create the world a better place, please inquire, please ask certain set of questions around for whom, in what period of time, and in what fashion, and what matter. Like not to use the statement as a PR mechanism. That would be helpful. That would be at least one step towards countering self-deception.
My name is Stefania Costantini. First of all, I just submitted a paper entitled Reflection and Introspection for Implementing Machine Ethics. So for me, with me, we're pushing an open door. But then I wanted to say, intelligent machines are software, okay? With software, there is the issue of certification and assurance, which is verifying both prior to deployment and at runtime, the software does things that are supposed to do and does not do certain other things. And this is very important with intelligent systems which are to some extent unpredictable. So software should be certified with respect to some ethical points and should also be, in my opinion, customizable by the user. That should be accountable for the customization. Okay? The user decides to tune the ethical parameters of the systems in this direction or other, but this is also certified. Okay? And then the user is accountable for the changes that it does to the system. Also, making the world a better place is to some extent true, because consider care robots, okay? Care robots, they are not human, so on and so forth. But if my children, as I hope, will live 120 years, as they say, there will be 4 generations of old people. So will never be enough young people to care about them. And so most people without the robot couldn't simply afford any care. Okay? And so the robot should also be certified and could be tuned by the user. For instance, if I were mortally ill, what should I prefer? To be told the truth ruthlessly or to be legal and so on? I believe I made my point.
Right. Well, thank you. So first thing is, I think certification is a useful step, but it cannot be the only step because we will run into the issue of, I think there's a greater degree of complexity in terms of both the proprietorial nature of the way we do algorithm writing versus what is being presented to broader society. So that's why I said, right, so that's why I said it's a good first step, but it cannot be the only step. Like there has to be something else that has to happen. To your latter question, New York Times a couple of years ago, there was something in that, and there was this terminology that was used that I really liked. It's called pizzled, to be pissed off and puzzled at the same time. So I'm puzzled with this particular problem. The particular problem, which is that 7 billion human beings on this planet, and loneliness is an epidemic. 7 billion human beings on this planet, and loneliness is an epidemic. Depression caused by loneliness, one of the highest costs of healthcare. And what we think is going to solve that issue, rather than challenging the prevalence of certain kind of human behavior, is to design care robots. That puzzles me. I understand. I have colleagues who are designing robots, care robots. I understand its application, and I appreciate the application in the medical terrain, how it works with kids in terms of doing better diagnosis and so on. I understand how it might provide a sense of company to a lonely adult someplace. But I think there's something off with this picture.
So there's a third point that you made
Please.
that I would like you to
Please.
address, which is, should the user of this technology have control within some range of knobs where they can put in their preferences in terms of the ethics, or is that something that should be decided on by the designer and casting stone?
I don't think it should be mutually exclusive. So from one side, I don't think the designers should be deciding on everything on behalf of the user. But on the other part, I also believe most users are not aware enough to make good ethical choices. And this is sort of this notion of this philosophical argument about free will and freedom of choice. That there's a lot of presumption that goes in to say that it's just an exercise of free will. It's not. It's simply freedom of choice. All we have these days is freedom of choice. It's not free will, per se. And by freedom of choice, I imply simply that we will make what we think are better choices within the options that are presented to us. And most of us, because of behavioral tendencies and so on, otherwise, dispositions of different sorts also, oftentimes we are not capable of making a good choice. Now, do we take responsibility for it? Yes.
So are you arguing for a big brother approach?
I am not. I'm arguing for an approach where people can make suggestions that this might be a better choice, given the whole thing. What I'm arguing initially is that everybody should go through some kind of training around how do we actually make decisions. That would be useful. Having had that training, then I think it can be a complementary relationship between the designers and the users, with varying degree of freedom given to both sides in order to come to a particular choice. No. But it's not an efficient process.
You put the word well-being at the center of some of your discussion, and I think that's a very important word. But to be a little more concrete, one of the things that I think contributes greatly to individual well-being is trust. And with trust, we can think of, well, trust in what?
Yep.
Am I going to trust the people to drive on the right side of the road? Am I going to trust people not to physically attack me as I might deserve for my opinions?
Unless you have grown up driving in India,
Well, yes.
where your driving patterns doesn't affect your ability to trust anything.
Well, I did a lot of driving in Boston and found that I could drive in Tijuana with no trouble at all. And so I think we can start asking questions about how to design ethical robots in terms of what kinds of trust do we want people to have in the sort of ordinary environment in society.
That's a great suggestion. Yes.
So I think this is
Yeah.
this is a point of leverage.
Right.
where
Right.
maybe
And that's something I can agree without reservations. I think if we can, but it's again the thing that we need to spend a bit more bandwidth in in breaking down the models of trust and understanding which ones actually correlate better with the sense of well-being. And some might have actually causal relationship to that as well. It might actually reduce our sense of growing anxiety about things. Yes, definitely.
My name is Dean Backward, PhD student at MIT. So my question is, one of the challenges I see as an engineer is that there is no ground truth of what it means to be ethical across the cultures. So as a designer of the system, what process do you recommend that people follow? What could be like, you have participatory design process where users, engineers, designers, policymakers, everybody's coming together and designing. But ethics are too long term thing. Like
Right.
culturally, as you grow, you
Right.
have to change.
Right.
So what's the recommendation that you have?
Nothing yet. Nothing yet. I am working with some colleagues at CSAIL, so hopefully we'll propose something in a month's time. But I think we need to get away from this sense of ground truth. That's an illusion. We hold it dear, but it's not there. I think, but elements such as well-being and its factors such as trust and so on, those are things I think we should be exploring more in terms of the design framework.
I don't want to overinterpret your training that you recommend, but I wonder if there isn't a slippery slope between training us to be ethical decision makers in the context of AI systems and becoming better subjects for machines. Is this going to make us, is this going to decrease the level of humanity we have when we relate to each other or to the machines themselves? Or is it going to free us from being subject to control by these things under the illusion that we're making choices?
Well, so what you referred to the latter part was the concern that I was referring to this gentleman's question, the illusion of choices in that regard. But when I'm talking about the ethical training, I think there are both short and long-term implications around it, right? So short-term implications is just in terms of what I'm suggesting is that we don't have very good tools, behavioral tools, that allows us to even relate to each other better, let alone understand what our roles and responsibilities in civic society is. And part of it is because of the kinds of metrics that we value the most. So for example, most countries value GDP as the most important metric for development. But GDP doesn't tell us anything about well-being of individuals. It doesn't even tell about the nature of trust in society. It doesn't even tell us about the notion of citizenship. What does it mean to be a good civic citizen, right? So unless and until we have certain forms of clearly defined metrics around those to be able to escalate that particular conversation, we cannot even say that we have good relationship with each other in terms of what's going on. So when I speak of ethical training, I am suggesting is that a set of critical thinking faculties that we develop in individuals or that allows us to sort of better relate to each other as one thing. And the second thing, that it allows us to better sort of design things and then create better relationships with that, right? And then, who knows, perhaps in the long future, if we have the artificial general intelligence that might have certain capability of becoming another species, we would appreciate some interspecies ethics at that point. Because again, if it was just for efficiency argument, we don't even qualify in the food chain system for AI. Complete redundancy in some ways. So my emphasis will be more on the immediate future of ethics. Please.
So, thank you so much. This is really interesting. I think one thing has been that historically, the right and wrong has been determined by people who are in powers of leadership and religion. And I'm curious
Right, right.
arise from that design?
Again, I think it's a longer conversation to have, but we do have certain experimental frameworks in place right now that we are testing in terms of, and again, religious groups don't like if we simply use the word secular ethics. We have had actually issues with that as well. So there have been other proposals like universal ethic. I don't like that either. Some say transversal ethics. So there are different kinds of models, but what I'm suggesting is that religious traditions can be sort of one relevant point historically and present where people actually derive the ethics learning from. They should not be the only one, right? But when I propose this critical thinking kind of faculty sort of thing, part of it is also the understanding that an individual can develop by him or herself around what are my own biases. You see, we are capable of that. We are capable of understanding our biases. And how can we override it and for what purpose, you see? And this is where the whole sort of framework of self-awareness is useful. There's no such thing as operating in complete vacuum, meaning, even lack of values is operating on certain set of values, right? So part of it is whether we can create a greater degree of clarity in individuals to understand where it is coming from. Norms are established by leadership, but we have seen norms changing over a period of time. And I think part of the thing is that can we work with probabilistic norms itself so that we don't become too, let me put it this way. Among all the ethics training program that I've learned, one thing that I have recognized, which is that it's very easy to become self-righteous and it's very difficult to become ethical. So that's the challenge that we see, whether it's from religious framework or secular framework. So, and self-righteousness is not a religious phenomena. It's a human behavioral phenomena. And so part of the thing is whether we can sort of help decode that and override that.
Yeah, I think you kind of partially answered this already, but you mentioned earlier that you're interested in empathetic AI, and then there was another terminology, self-reflective AI.
Introspective, yeah. I mean, and this is again, for individuals who are, making arguments around singularity and not making much distinction between, the human faculties versus what are the faculties that can be developed in AI and so on. One of the things is that, we are driven by reward circuitry of various sorts. There's no reward circuitry in AI. And nothing that I see in the long-term future around it. But the issue becomes is that when we talk about, an AI where human is not going to be in the loop, okay, that it needs to be sort of a, self-evaluating, self-producing system of some sort. We need to figure out, what would be the driver around it. In humans, introspection is one of the mechanisms by which we correct our behaviors. Right? At least those of us who choose to, right? But the faculty is available to us. And so the issue becomes is that, can we design certain parameters in machine learning and AI systems that could be closely associated with this form of introspection? Because as long as human is in the loop, there will be biases. But as a friend of mine, Reid Hoffman, who told me yesterday that perfect is the enemy of good. So I don't want to aim for designing a perfect AI system, but a good AI system, an ethical one, if possible.
One last question.
So you mentioned biases and how the implicit biases of people in this room might surface in the work we do in the coming years. Big fan of Jonathan Haidt's framework of moral psychology.
Mm-hmm.
What I saw very little of here were presentations about the purity aspects of morality, or the value of inbound loyalty, or respect for authority. Reasons for that we can speculate on, but we saw a lot about care and fairness. This pretty cleanly falls along the lines of where Jonathan Haidt would say you have liberals and conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
How would we incorporate what are traditionally seen as more conservative values into the work we're doing in
I know, Jonathan, and there are certain issues that I just leave to the camp of moral psychologists. It helps them with the tenure process and publications. As a monk, you have a freedom to share a lot of things, and it sort of, gives a continuation of ideas. There are people who make those ideas better. Some give credit to the monk, some don't, and then they have their own karma to deal with. But that's how this world functions. I think the issue with I'm not looking for a pure ethical system. Okay. That's why I'm suggesting this again, that perfect is the enemy of good. Okay. That as an aspirational model, yes, that should be the North Star. We should think about it, but we don't have any agreements about it. Now, in the absence of agreement, should we not even get to a state where we can optimize for well-being? That's why if you want to take anything from this talk, you can forget about the rest of it, I won't take it personally, well-being is the key thing, which is that how do we design systems that are more conducive to promoting individual and social well-being?
Good, I think we can end.
Well, thank you so very much.